Hi, John.
Hey, Angela, nice to see you again.
Yes, always.
So, we don't have a formal script, but Angela and I have been talking to each other for close to 50 years,
Yes.
and hopefully we'll get another 50. And more than just talking, we work together, we've supported each other. So I think given what your work is, given what your life is, given what you said this morning, and then given what the audience have just had a chance to review, the issue of moving from othering to belonging, the chance of making equity real, certainly the heart is essential, but by itself is not enough. Um, how do you think about structures, culture, and even stories that animate and realize that we are not only connected, that we all belong? Um, and I'll throw it back to you, Angela, but one of the things I think about is the stories we tell now oftentimes make it harder for us to realize that we belong to each other, that we belong to the earth. We tell stories that actually lift up oftentimes, more often than not, pulling us apart, which we call breaking. So how do we actually help tell better stories and then live into them so they don't just become stories, they become possibilities, they become inspiration, they become a way forward? Any thoughts about that?
I have a ton of thoughts about that, John. I have spent most of my adult life being an advocate, working sometimes in confrontational ways, sometimes in more persuasive ways. But most of that time has been spent trying to impact policy and systems and institutions, and trying to do it in a way that is just very logical. Looking at a problem and seeing what's not right, not just not fair, but not just not right, and having real outrage about it, and thinking if I'm going to do anything in life, I'm going to do something about that. I've had success, if you want to call success, seeing a system change, seeing a needle move, um, seeing a policy come into being. But I have to admit that after 50 years, we're stuck. We're stuck. It's not that we haven't made progress, but it's not sustainable. It's not guaranteed. It's not a platform that we stand on as we try to spiral up to the next place. It's delicate. It's impermanent, and we keep going back and forth. And it's that frustration that's led me to the conclusion that you may have reached a long time ago. Because I think that I have a suspicion that you have been more of a hearts person than I have, that I was a systems person, a policy person, an advocacy person. But I have recognized that I come at it because of what's in my heart, because of what was in my family, because of what was in my neighborhood, in my church, and that I have given inadequate attention to those same aspects of the people who I wanted to move. And oddly enough, I'm a latecomer to notions of joy and love being part of the work. Those were not words that I used, but I have come to realize, actually through a podcast that I do called Radical Imagination, and I interviewed Adrienne Marie Brown, who talks about pleasure activism. And I must say, talking with her changed my whole attitude, because she made the point that if you do not have a vision of joy that is connected with whatever it is you're working on, it's not an authentic vision of change. And as I reflected on that, I realized that I was a secret joy seeker. I create a lot of joy in my life, but that wasn't my work. You know, it's like my family is my joy. Swimming is my joy. I had lots of joys, but they were separate from my work. That conversation caused me to move joy more front and center. And the other thing that I have moved front and center is the story, because I realize that everything you do is animated by a story that you have told yourself. Sometimes it's a scary story, sometimes it's a negative story, sometimes it's an aspirational story, sometimes you just think it's a true story and nothing you can do about it. So I agree with you 100% on both things that you have lifted up. One is that what's in our hearts is not enough, but if it's not in our hearts, it's not sustainable. When we put it in our policies, in our institutions, it can be gone tomorrow. And the other is that we need to translate our beliefs into a story that everybody can see themselves in and have a sense that they can be a part of it.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we can leave now.
Okay. But, I do think that the way that some people hear belonging suggests that we can get there by not having to go through race. And we can't. That there is no belonging if there are people who feel marginalized because of race and ethnicity and those things. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
How they relate?
As you know, our institute is called the Othering and Belonging Institute, and it's made up of 7 clusters, and those clusters focus both on populations and on issues. And so race is one of the issues, and but so is gender, so is LGBTQ, so is disability. And when I first got there, about 10 years ago now, we had these 7 clusters, and we were called the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. And without rewriting history, I would say that it was closer in some ways to what you described in terms of policy. And there was a little bit of competition between the different groups. And of course, Kimberly Crenshaw talked about intersectionality, but having said that, still each group was like, no, my group is the one that really suffers. I know you suffer too, but my group really suffers. And a couple of things, and this was an evolution. It occurred to me that they all were experiencing systematic othering. They all were being denied their full humanity. And they all wanted to fully belong. They all wanted to be fully recognized and fully participate in the world that they were co-creating. And they weren't against each other. They just didn't really deeply hear each other. And then, again, there was a sense of competition. And over a period of time, we moved to the othering and belonging because we felt that underneath each one of those expressions, there's the architect of othering. Now, just in terms of personal biography, some of you may know I've lived in many different parts of the world. My daughter was born in Tanzania. I tell her, we might change our terminology from African Americans to something else. She will always be an African American. She's literally an African and an American. And what I saw in working in places like Tanzania, South Africa, living and working in places like India, it's just othering is extremely grounded in virtually every society. And they don't all do it the same, and they sometimes argue about it. So when I was in India, people would come up to me and say, tell me about racism in the United States, with a real curiosity, without any critical look at the caste system. And just so happens that if not 100%, but caste is also colorized in India. And so what I felt like is that this is something that comes up a lot in different human societies. And not to be too academic, but in studying it, it became clear that each society had a primary way, a fundamental way of othering. So in India, it is the caste system. And other forms of othering actually gets mediated through how they understand the caste system. And that's partially what Isabel Wilkins' new book is about. In the United States, that fundamental way of othering is race. So race is the penultimate expression of othering in the United States. When you have that, you have not only what's happening to the group that's being marginalized, but it also becomes defining for the majority group. So that the dialects, or what was called the untouchables, not only define something about them, it also defines something about the Brahmins, that there's a relationship there, uneven, asymmetrical, hierarchical relationship. But I feel like, and especially what's happening in the world today, we needed to sort of understand that history and those relationships. And in the United States, I would agree that race has been, and not just I would agree, I think people who studied it, you talked this morning about the paradigm. And the thing that we don't understand about a paradigm, the paradigm is a structure, is how we look at the world. And it doesn't mean, so if we have a black-white paradigm, it doesn't mean it's just about black people and white people. It means this is the way we organize our view of the world. And so in the United States, historically, the closer you are to white, the better off you are through many indicators. The closer you are to black, the worse you are. It doesn't mean just black and white people. It becomes a way of organizing the world. So I do think in the United States, and Howard Winnan and Michael Omi's written a lot about this. They call it the master category. But it's not master across the world. It's master in the United States. It has implications across the world, in part because the United States and Britain, more Britain, was a global colonial power. But in that colony was India. In that colony was China. And so I want to be careful that even as we understand how deeply rooted it is in the United States, that we don't engage in what I would call intellectual imperialism and assume that the Chinese and Indians organize their othering and belonging exactly like we do along race. So in the United States, we have to address race, not, as you said this morning, to help black people, but to actually, this is an American project. If we're going to change the United States, we have to change the way we think about this paradigm. We have to come up with a different paradigm. The last thing I'll say on this for now, coming up with a different paradigm is complicated because it's not just doing something different, it's being different. Mm-hmm. It actually means we will not have the same meaning associated with whiteness and blackness that we do today. If you go back and look at early definition of whiteness was not black. They didn't have a positive definition. It's just that you're not black. In California, they're literally Anglo and a Latino are talking, and they have some proposed laws that would make California only available to whites. And they don't know what whites are. And these are two powerful people. And they said, well, it means not black. And it's okay, we can live with that. What I'm suggesting is that these definitions, these meanings, these frameworks keep changing. They're not stable. What we do change them. And so that's why James Baldwin said there's no hope for us as long as they think they're white. And what he really was saying, as long as their identity is organized around white superiority, white hierarchy, there's no hope for us. If you take away white superiority and white dominance, what's left of whiteness? It's certainly not what we see on everyday in our society. It's something else. And part of what we have to do is not only reject that old, we have to also propose the future. We have to tell the story about the future. And I oftentimes say in talking about this that as we interrogate and shift from the ideology of superiority and white supremacy, we're not talking about people who are necessarily phenotypically white. We're talking about an ideology. And if you need any clarification of that, just think about Justice Thomas. Justice Thomas, to me, embodies the concept of white supremacy, even though he's, I think, the same hue as I am.
So, listening to you talking about othering and belonging reminds me of why art is so powerful in helping us see things that we sometimes can't see otherwise. It has to do with the universal and the particular. That sometimes people write, and often it's academics, but not always, about universally what's going on, which is kind of the way I take in othering and belonging. That you and your colleagues have done a magnificent job of looking all across the globe and seeing there is a pattern here. And it is a pattern that's repeated again, again, and again. And that phrase, othering and belonging, just really captures it. And what I was talking about this morning was the loving and loving versus Virginia. Was that what it was? Loving, was that the movie? I'm talking about the particular. And for me, the particular starts in St. Louis, Missouri, on the 4900 block of Terry in the 1950s. And it branches out to the whole nation. But within the particular, it is race. And it is all race all the time. And being able to hold those thoughts together is often the challenge. And it's not a challenge with the person that John Lewis was just talking with on the film, because that was the extremes. You had John Lewis, who as a teenager was dedicating his life to doing something about the way racism was marginalizing and placing Black people as second-class citizens at extreme disadvantage and poverty. And the person who had been cruel to him was fighting it with every bit of energy that he had, driven by hate. That is not the problem that I deal with every day. The problem that I deal with every day is how to be able to reach and galvanize the overwhelming majority of people in this country who actually want to live in a different way. Many of them are of color. Many of them are people with disabilities. Many of them are people who are transgender and gay and lesbian. Many of them are living in poverty. Many of them have studied what it is to find your best self and are working every day toward doing that. Many of them are just good people because they came up in good families. And while no mother ever went on a march and no father ever put his body on the line for anybody, what they heard at the dinner table after school was, you be nice to your classmates, all of them. That's the majority of the people in the United States. And what we have not been able to do is recognize that the thing that is holding us back is because we haven't dealt with the racism, that we allow school systems to operate where if you live in one neighborhood, you go to a school that is as good as any that can be paid for with every dollar that could be earned, and it is a public school. You live in another area of the city and you go to a public school that has nothing, is producing nothing, and it's been doing it for decades. And we live in these cities and we're okay with it. We are in places where we just want to have the homelessness moved out of our neighborhoods. We're not demanding that we get rid of homelessness. You just don't want to wake up and see it in the morning. We allow ourselves to have people locked up in prison for no good reason, have people harassed on the streets when they're not doing anything, or if they're doing something that's wrong, it's worth this, not a bullet in your heart. We live with that because it is happening to people that somewhere deep in our bones in this nation, we have let them be at the bottom of the hierarchy of human value. So that if you're forced to think about it, it seems outrageous, but when you live with it every day, something about it kind of seems okay. And if we could just find all the people who really know that that's wrong and have it become accepted, that it's the way that we have dealt with the difference of race in this nation that has allowed us to develop institutions and systems and policies that perpetuate the wrong on all kinds of people. People who've never seen a Black person are suffering in a society in which Black people were deemed to be at the bottom of the hierarchy of human value, and we allowed our economic and other systems to be developed on that hierarchy. And so, John, I just love that you have been able to put that in a context globally and to give us something that wherever you happen to land, that you can know there's othering going on. And you need to be sure that you're finding it and that you're standing up against it. My son likes to quote me on this because I try to live up to it. I fail every day. But the thing that I try to live up to is that if I am in the room, your back is covered. no matter what your back might be. That's what I try to do, because that's what we have to do, which means identify that othering and work against it. But in this context, we cannot jump to that's just othering, because it is a racial othering, because that's our othering. And so we have got to deal with that in the particular.
Well, I would agree and add a couple of things. So, first of all, as we know, race as we understand it is only about 500 years old. So China, as a country, in its various forms, is about 6,000 years old. So as we focus on the particular, if we really understand that this is our particular, it is not, what we do too often is we take the particular and you universalize it.
Mm-hmm.
We want to understand, and that's both lazy and wrong. I don't need to try to understand you because you're just a warmed up version of me. Maybe a little shorter, maybe a little lighter, maybe a little younger, but you're just me. And actually that's baked into Western philosophy, and I won't go into that. There was an article recently in the paper, and the article was, the fight coming in the future will largely be between China and the United States. And the people actually cast that fight between two economic systems. The people cast that fight between two political systems. And yes, that's part of it. But they said the deep fight is between Taoism and Cartesian. And I shared that with someone, and they said, they didn't ask what Taoism was. They asked, what is Cartesian? Again, not to take you down the rabbit hole of philosophy, but it's the Western concept of organizing the world. The individualists, going back to Descartes. Descartes talked about, he built on the notion of separation. The notion of separation, which is essential in terms of Western thought, starts with we are separate from the universe, or we're separate from the divine. Then the second iteration of that is we're separate from nature. Then the third iteration of that is we're separate from each other. Descartes said, here's the capstone, the mind is separate from the body. He went on to say that the mind is superior than the body. So the mind had to control the body. That because we're separate from each other, the one at the top, which became both white and male, had to control those lower parts of our being, that is female and non-white. In our relationship with nature, going back to Genesis 1:23, God gave man dominion over the earth and all things. The earth is to be dominated by man. It's to be exploited. And so on. So that separation, to me, and I've written about this, is actually very deeply ingrained in Western society. And I would say it comes very close to actually approximation of what the ideology of whiteness is really about. It's about separation and domination. And when you're separate from things, not only do you not understand them, you're afraid of them. And the only way you understand them, the only way you put at ease that other that you're afraid of is to dominate it. Now think about this. I don't know if any of you have children, but Graham's fairy tales. There's a theme in Graham's fairy tales, and the theme is this. Little Red Riding Hood goes into the woods, not to a park, not to a playground. She goes into the woods. What's scary about the woods? Now, we're already supposed to be scary. Grimm's fairy tale. We're going to tell you a terrible story. This little girl goes into the woods. What's scary about the woods? The woods are out of control. Woods we don't control. We like parks because grass, you stay here. Tree, you stay here. I'm going to order things. I'm going to control things. As long as I can control things, I'm okay. But when I can't control things, it is scary. Going back to the Chinese. We don't even know what Taoism is. We don't even know what Cartesianism is. We just live it. But the reason I think that's important It's because, yes, there are 360 million people who call themselves Americans from the United States. There are 1.360 plus million people who call themselves Chinese. There are 4 times more people than we are. I had a student who got his PhD, I think from Berkeley, in world philosophy. And I'm talking to him. And I said, he's telling me, you know, and I minored in philosophy. It's been a long time ago, but, you know, most philosophers.
I did too.
Yeah, you know, so we talked about Wittgenstein and Descartes and, you know, Sartre. And so I said, so what do you think about Confucianism? Silence. It's like, well, I didn't study Confucianism. I say 60% of the world organized the worldview around Confucius. You study world philosophy, and you know nothing about 60% of the people on the planet? So the reason I'm going through all this is that I think in the US context, what you said is absolutely right. I think there's some things we have to be careful of, and that is not to essentialize race in the United States, which is can come close to that. But the other thing is not to universalize it, not to assume we can understand what's going on in China through our particulars. Because to me, again, that becomes very close again to Western imperialism, that they're just some other version of ourselves. But in the U.S. context, I completely agree. And I think that even in China, we have something we can teach them, and they have something they can teach us. But you, in particular, that young, brilliant girl from St. Louis is a globetrotter. You're all over the world.
So, you know, we have so much in common. I, too, minored in philosophy, started off as a major in philosophy, but, you know, you get to the end of the school time and you say, well, like how many classes do you have to take? And you have some prerequisites. So I ended up having to minor in it rather than graduating in a major. And as a young family, my husband and I moved to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, which you also talked about. And then we were both public interest lawyers in different ways. So we've been along the same tracks. And yet, we are in different places in the way that we're framing our struggles. And I really am obsessed with making a difference here. Obsessed with it because it is within our reach. It is within our reach. And the reason that I have started talking about thriving multiracial democracy is because I realize that if we could get democracy right within the context of profound difference, which is what we have right here, it will be important not just for here, but it will be important globally. And so when I think about how to get started and what to do, it does seem that we have an opportunity right now to be able to do something different. And the do something different requires that we do the thing that you and I are both talking about in slightly different ways, but it's exactly the same thing. Understanding how the one piece of our existence that we don't like to talk about is holding us back as a nation from being able to step into that leadership position. And there's no going around it, right? You can't go around the fact that we have this deeply embedded racism that keeps us from being able to do anything. We can't develop a fair economy until we deal with it. We can't have a thriving democracy until we deal with it. We can't utilize our environment in ways that are sensible. We keep throwing away communities, right? We build up communities and then we throw them away. And then we decide we want them back and we move out all the poor people to another community that we throw away. We can't even figure out how to live until we deal with it. And so I just want to make sure that people get committed to that. So how do you do that? And that was part of what I was trying to talk about this morning. One way that we do it is we really go back and get the history right. I do think it's important to put it in the broader context, but we got to get the history right. We cannot ignore it. You just gotta get it. You got to tell people about it. And the pushback now on what young people can learn and what they can read, we have to fight that with everything that we've got, because that takes us backwards more than anything else. We've got to do that. But then we have to begin to actually think about, what is equity? What is equity? For 20 plus years, 22, I think, I ran an organization called PolicyLink. I'm the founder in residence now. And one of the things that PolicyLink has done under the extraordinary leadership of Michael McAfee, who's now the CEO, is that they got President Biden to sign the first executive order that he signed was to do a racial equity audit of all the government agencies. About 2.5, 3 weeks ago, the results of that audit came forward, and it was a launch. Ambassador Susan Rice, who is the head of Domestic Policy Council, led the whole thing off. 93 agencies have looked at how their agencies have both advanced inequity and how they can advance racial equity. It is important that we do that analysis, because once we recognize that race stands in the way, we need to understand the degree to which it has stood in the way and how we're going to move forward. And there has to be urgency about that. There has to be urgency because we don't have forever. This moment that we're in, it's lasted longer than many people predicted, but we're still in it. We're still in a moment charged with racial sensitivity and curiosity and analysis and people wanting to do better. We have got to use this to be able to say, what does it actually mean, not just to do better, but to do what we need to do? And then we have to figure out a way to hold our systems accountable for getting there. All of this requires that people be different. That's what I like about what you said. It's not just to think different, but you have to be different. And being different has to bring with it a sense of urgency about how whatever it is you care about, if it's the environment, if it's the economy, if it's democratic participation, if it is your family life, if it is the community you live in, it will not survive if we can't figure out how to get through this.
Well, I would agree with that. And although I can't say, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but it could be taken as this, the rest of the world has to wait.
The rest of the world what?
Have to wait, right? I mean, I think that...
Oh, no. If you're working in another part of the world, you need to be right on it too. There's no sense in what I said of do this first and then do that. No.
So if you think about the pandemic, some of you are still wearing masks. Most of you are still wearing masks. When we got the news that there had been an outbreak in China, I remember saying to someone, I may have said it to part of my staff, the virus is here. We live in a global world. Mm-hmm. And the response by many people, including our the Trump administration, let me just say that, it's like, let's build a wall, let's ban flights from China, let's ground all the airplanes, let's kick the Muslims out. It's like, what are you doing? It's here. That the world is smaller and smaller. So what I'm really saying, I mean, and I don't think she's here, but I have nieces and nephews who were born in China. I have family, not 6 generations ago, family who live in Ghana. And so what I'm saying is, with the technology, with the world becoming smaller and smaller, it seems to be one of the imperatives is to say to everyone you count. And now if you have it's not a way of saying, therefore, I don't have to deal with race in the United States. But it's also saying, when I'm dealing with people, not just in India, but Indians in the United States. And there are huge fights right now between Indians in the United States on caste. And I'm saying there's a danger of taking our particularity and making it the particularity. And I think that's frankly even more expressed in the United States. And so when someone comes to me, and someone has, I was just at a thing from Race Forward, and the person I was in conversation was a Black trans woman. And her position is that that's the most marginal group. And if you deal with that group, you deal with all the other groups. And I say, yes, and, because I think there's a danger of saying to Native Americans that your issue comes through our issue. And it's not iterative back and forth. There's not space to say, yes, being Native American, or yes, being trans, or yes, being disabled means you have a pivotal role as well. And even going further, I would say, in terms of this new world that we're trying to co-create, that this new world is clearly about all of us. It's not simply about Black. It's not simply even about Black and white. It really is about all of us. And the expression of denying that takes a particularly hard focus around race in the United States. But I was just with some people from England. Excuse me, I said England. They're really from Europe. England was represented, but not just England. And they talked about the struggles they're having in mixed communities in Ireland. Of course, they meant Catholic and Protestant. And for them, all the issues get boiled down to that, right? It's like the religious difference between Protestant and Catholics is the penultimate. And maybe it is the penultimate in Ireland. So I guess I'm just saying the space of actually saying it's the othering, however it's expressed, and yes, it's expressed in a very hard way in the United States. And there is an avoidance. But I think there's not just an avoidance. I think there's also sometimes a sort of drilling down and making that the issue. And I certainly see that when I go out in the field. People, frankly, sometimes African Americans have a hard time having space for Native American issues, have a hard time having space for Muslim issues, have a hard time having space for Latino issues, because they think they insist upon reducing everything to the one issue. And to be even more blunt, the way race is understood is problematic, because race is understood in that context as a singular thing, as a set thing, and as an essential thing. It's not understood as an ideology that frames everything else. It's understood as something that actually only or primarily comes through the lens of Black people, maybe with white people as the perpetrators. So I think if we're going to have a world, yes, the United States is ready to implode, but we came within a hair of having a nuclear war with China when Trump was in the White House. And part of that is not understanding the relationship between China and the United States. America has embraced the notion that China is our enemy. And even Obama embraced that notion that China is our enemy, that they have to remain subject to the West. And I'm not giving China a pass, but a lot of what they did was a reaction to the British and now the Americans saying you have to remain a supplicant. And they're saying, no, we're not going to remain a supplicant. And most Americans don't think about that. And if we don't think about that and get that wrong, maybe our racial issue will be taken care of, but not because we resolve it, because we won't be here. So we have to be really clear. We do live in a world. We share a world. And that world is not distance. That world is not millions of miles away. It's on our computer. You know, you just say, look at half the stuff you're wearing. It's made in China. We're talking about a supply chain. We're part of this small, shrinking world. So I'm not suggesting that we de-emphasize the role of race in the United States, but I am suggesting that we acknowledge that the othering process happens in complex ways and in different ways in different parts of the world, and it's changing even in the United States, and that every group have legitimate claims to not being othered. Every group have legitimate claims to belong. And the last thing I'll say on this is that, and it's belonging without othering, because to create a sense of belonging at the expense of another group not belonging is not what we're talking about. We talk about the circle of human concern is similar to what you're saying, I got everybody's back in here, is that I'm not othering anyone. Any system and structure that does that, I reject. And in the United States, that's been hard, the hardcore part of that has been around race. But that's not the only part.
So I have not had the experience that you have had with Black people across the board having any difficulty identifying with the plight of other people who are oppressed. That's just not been my experience. That I actually find that Black people are very responsive to oppression. They get it. They get it instantly. When you are an oppressed person, you know it when you see it, and you sometimes see it even before another oppressed person sees it. You recognize it. Black people have a real identification with Indigenous people. It's always been part of my life that my daughter is named Alyssa, and she is named after a woman that I heard about all my life who was my grandmother's mother. My grandmother's mother. Yeah. Yeah. You know, once you start going back, was it my great grandmother, my great great grandmother? My grandmother was born in 1886. It was her mother. And her mother was Native American. And she married a man who was Black and was a slave. And by marrying, he got out of slavery. And so I always heard about this woman, her name was Eliza Ellison, who got that part of the family out of slavery. So I was pregnant, you know, modern day. I knew it was going to be a girl, thinking about, well, what should I name her? I said, we need to honor that woman. And so we ended up naming her Alyssa. But that story, there's nothing unusual about that story. Black people identify. Black people identify with oppression when they see it. They're often impatient, though, with people who are not as aggressive as they are in terms of calling it out, which is why sometimes I think that gets interpreted as not appreciating the nuances of the difference. Because, as I said in my morning talk, Black people talk about race all the time. It is not hard to talk about it. You grow up, 2 years old, that's what I was hearing my family talk about. You talk about it, you got an analysis about it, you got a plan about it, and there can be an impatience with people who are also being oppressed and don't see it. And it is often the race that hits you first. Now, as a Black woman, I can certainly speak to this because I grew up being outraged about what was happening to Black people. And I was a young woman, probably in my 30s, before I began to realize that a lot of what I was experiencing was because I was a woman. Because I hadn't focused on being a woman. I was so outraged about what was happening to Black people, I hadn't been outraged about what was happening to women. And once I began to see it, I became very aggressive about what was happening to women because I was already aggressive about what was happening to Black people. So I wasn't shy about that. I actually think, though, that failure to be able to go back and do what I was talking about when I spoke earlier about understanding how that Black-white paradigm set the protocols, the terms, the institutionalization of oppression, it is important to think about that. Because one of the things that I often see is, let me back up and say it a different way. When Black Lives Matter became the saying that people were using, a whole lot of people wanted to say all lives matter. And a lot of the people who wanted to say all lives matter did not want to go there because they were trying to dismiss that Black lives matter. They were saying all lives matter because all meant something to them. And all means something to me. The definition that we use for equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, that all means something to me. And I think a lot of people who wanted to say all lives matter, it meant something to them. And that many people were unjustly accused of dismissing the Black part of it. Some people just didn't want to go to Black, but some people wanted to make sure that we were thinking about the all. And what I would say to people about why that was missing something by not being able to say Black Lives Matter is because so often it really does get down to Black, that to me, all lives don't matter if transgender lives don't matter. And transgender lives don't matter if Black transgender lives don't matter. And if you look at the data in terms of who is most likely to be harassed, it turns out it's a transgender woman who's Black. And so being able to understand that all is deeply important. We can't just glide over this at the top and think we've got it. And a lot of people do react in ways that you described when you said that sometimes Black people aren't as generous or as embracing in the struggle of others because they don't know the story, because white people don't embrace the story of what's happened to Black people because they don't know. We have to educate ourselves. There's no way through this if we don't do it. And we've got to start telling some simple stories because everybody's not going to go to graduate school to figure this out. That we have to figure out a way to translate into simple stories that we see when we're seeing a commercial on television. Simple stories that if you're reading a problem in a textbook as a child, a simple story. So if we're just talking about the way that we're going to interact, I was in Paris, went to a playground in Paris, and it was dedicated to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it had a plaque that had more information on it than I have seen in most textbooks in the United States. But it was just there for you to read when you went to that playground. We've got to be able to get that in because we don't have forever to figure it out. And if we don't figure it out, we're going to keep repeating the sins of the past.
So, I won't keep going over this, but I think PolicyLink does a lot of work in the community, and so does the Other Men Belong Institute. And I can just tell you that the experience, first of all, I'm a little uncomfortable, frankly, talking about Black people in a monolith. Black people represent every hue. Mm-hmm. When we did the survey with Prosperity Now on disband or abolish the police, with a focus on Minnesota, with a focus in Minneapolis, the majority of Black people did not support that. Yet it was representative. This is the Black position. And what it was the Black activist position, but it was not the Black community's position. If you look at, and we've done a lot of surveys, so it's not just my experience. These surveys reflect the complexity. We are one of the anchor institutions right now for reparations. When one of the issues that came up is like, who is eligible for reparations? A lot of people, and the majority, frankly, at the Reparations Commission for California, said you had to have a certain experience, that if you weren't born, if you didn't have grandparents who were enslaved in the United States, you're not eligible for reparations. Because the experience in the United States was unique. What most people missed, including apparently most people on the commission, many of whom are educated, is that slavery in the Caribbean, in many instances, was worse than the United States. But we know our own pain, but we're not willing to acknowledge that other people, in this case, other Black people, they're not historically Black Americans, but they are Black people. But that's not good enough because we sort of, it's been said by many people, we have a fidelity to our own pain, but an inability to see other people's pain. When at the height of the attacks on Asian Americans, I wrote a piece basically talking about we need to stand with our Asian Americans, brothers and sisters. On social media, including among a lot of Black activist friends, attacked me for that because they felt like I was detracting from focus on Black people. And so it's not just, I'm not just saying something as this is actually happening in America right now. We're fracturing. And I would say, frankly, that many of people who are out there in the social media are not nearly as generous as you about saying all. And there's a belief that we have to focus on our own, and our own is narrowly defined. In this case, around reparations, it's not even including people who've had an enslavement experience but weren't born 2 generations in the United States. And I think the fracturing that's happening can, and in fact is happening between the different groups. And I think part of the way we tell our story, Bob Marley said, every man thinks his burden is the heaviest, is we need to tell a story that allows for other people's suffering as well. And I'm not saying to diminish African American suffering, but neither do I want to diminish Native American suffering. And we don't know their story. And there was a big fight between Palestinian students and Black students, partially at Berkeley. And what the Palestinian students said is that, yes, we know and we support the work of anti-blackness in America, but you know nothing about Palestinians. And so what I'm saying is that a platform and a future that's clear, that reflects what you said, that we mean all. And so we have to learn about all. And we have to actually, the leadership has to make it clear about all. So that's why I think in some ways, I think substantively, there's very little difference between what you're saying and what I'm saying. I think that there's a difference in terms of emphasis. And what I would insist, and what we insist at the Institute, is that it's the belonging for everyone and the othering for no one that we stand behind. And that takes on particular expression, but it doesn't mean taking on one expression denies another expression. And I think for practice, not what you're saying, but in practice, when people were saying, don't talk about violence against Asian Americans because, and some people even went so far as to say, they're honorary whites. They're complicit with white society. You saw the same thing around Ukraine. And so I think there is this danger of not seeing other people's pain, of wanting to define the world just in terms of our own experience without hearing other people's experience. And I think when we do that, the chance of actually turning this into something really good is greatly diminished.
And I agree. And there is a danger in not seeing when we really are making progress. I must say, when people talk about is the glass half empty or half full, for me, it is so half full. Because you talk about the struggle around reparations. I am so elated that we're having conversations about reparations. I never thought that was going to happen. And not only are we having conversations about reparations, but California has a commission focused on it. Gary, Indiana, and other places have actually tried to see what they can do within their local communities, and they're calling it reparations. And people aren't going to understand what that is. That is amazing to me. I mean, I will tell you that I did not think in my lifetime that I would see serious conversation in the United States of America about reparations. I did not think in my lifetime that I would see CEOs of major corporations doing something as simple as taking a knee. Now, I don't want to make a bigger deal out of that than it is, because that didn't take anything out of them. That was not a big deal, but it was a big deal. Because for the most part, people who were white male CEOs didn't think that what happened to a poor black man in some city in America had anything to do with them, but they had no obligation to respond. Not only did they have those gestures, and that's what taking a knee was, but they have put huge money behind trying to figure out what to do with these problems. I did not think I would have some of the conversations I have had in the past 20 months, that I have had so many conversations with people, many of whom, the majority, have been white, who have come to me to say, how can I lead this institution? How can I lead that whatever it is? It might be a foundation, it might be a corporation, it might be a university, it might be a civic association, it might be a huge not-for-profit. White people questioning their legitimacy to lead institutions when these institutions have to quickly step into a moment where race is front and center and they are being challenged about how it is that they're going to deal with these issues going forward. I did not expect to see something that I have seen, and it took me a while to realize I was seeing it. I love games, and I enjoy Wheel of Fortune. I've been watching Wheel of Fortune for decades, because I think they've been on about 30 years. And sometimes I almost feel like I need to sneak to watch it, because it's just so, it's like my private joy, another one of my private joys. Since George Floyd was killed, every episode, every night of Wheel of Fortune has a black person on it. Have you noticed that? Or none of you watch Wheel of Fortune? Every night. I thought to myself, well, I never even thought about it. Never even thought about it. But what that says is that those networks have gotten so much pressure that they have figured out that they have got to change. Things are changing in this society. I am not naive about how fundamental the change has to be transformative. But I am also not blind to the fact that there are people and institutions and resources that are running as fast as they can to figure out how to do something different. And I think we got to take note of that. We have got to take note of that. Right, John?
Well, I completely agree. And as you know, what Angela didn't say is they've been working a lot on this with the Biden administration, and so have we. And one of the differences that in terms of the Biden administration is that from my perspective, there are a lot of people who want to do the right thing. They sometimes shoot themselves in the foot. And they shoot themselves in the foot sometimes by unnecessarily narrowly defining what they're doing. And, we worked on, with PolicyLink's help, we worked on getting Judge Jackson to become Justice Jackson. And when we started that work, the polling, not that this tells everything, but the polling was in the low 40s to high 30s of Americans supporting her candidacy. And by the time she was nominated and confirmed, it was in the 70s. And part of it was not backing away, but telling a story so other people could be in it. So it's like we are part, we're one of the anchor institutions of reparations. So yes, we think it's important, but we also think we leave a lot on the table because we define the issue in such a way that unnecessarily piss other people off, unnecessarily say that your interests don't count. And I'm not saying, yes, so Angela, you talked about some of the successes you had in your life, and yet where we are as a society, where we are as a world. A lot of things have come forward, and it's like that old saying, is it good or bad? It's too early to say. We are running out of time. And part of what I'm positing is, can we actually accelerate this? And can we accelerate it? And I think part of the way is to make it clear that, yes, we are about everyone. Yes, we are about everyone without apologies. And it doesn't mean that we have to apologize for being grounded in addressing racism and anti-Black racism in particular. But that doesn't have to translate into, therefore, you step back. Therefore, we don't care about you. And I can tell you from a lot of the activists, a lot of the writing that's happening right now, I can give you some concrete examples. I'll just give you one. And these are people I know. So many of them are friends. Think about Robin DiAngelo's work. What she describes is actually quite, I'll just say it's quite. So she describes white fragility and Black trauma. White fragility and Black trauma. So if you're in a meeting or something happens and you freak out and you're white, it's too easy from Robin DiAngelo's perspective to say that's fragility. It's not deserving of any empathy. Why? Because you're white. If you're in a meeting and something happens and you freak out and you're Black, from Robin DiAngelo's perspective, that's trauma. We need to understand it. We need to support it. And I'm not saying there's not some performance happening in either direction when these things happen, but to categorically assume that if you're white and you're struggling, emotionally and otherwise, that's fragility, that you're being a butterfly, you're being whatever, a Karen, and we don't have to take it seriously, is saying your pain doesn't really count. And at the same time, she then turns around and says, we should care about Black people's pain. I say we should care about pain, and we should also care about it being institutionalized and weaponized. So there's some complexity that matters. And in the midst of this, sometimes we galvanize our own group by alienating another group gratuitously. I think we have to be careful with that. And I'm not unmindful of the fact that there are not many Black people in this audience. And so let me just turn a little bit, because I think Bioneers has done a real powerful service to this community over decades, and I think we should applaud Nina and Kenny for the work they've done. And my sense is a lot of people who come here, disproportionately white, are not grounded in the racial justice struggle in the way that you're describing, and are more likely to be grounded in what's called the spiritual community. And I've written about this, and so I just want to put it out there. So In cases there's any misunderstanding, I agree with almost everything Angela said, including not de-emphasizing race, not de-emphasizing anti-Black racism. And I also worry that sometimes in the spiritual community, people want to bypass. They want to say, instead of dealing with these hard issues like inadequate housing or police shooting or redlining, I'm going to keep myself calm and quiet my mind. I know that's a little bit of a caricature, but the separation between the spirituality and the practical is something that I worry about. And I think if I'm reading right, that's more likely to be the case of the Bioneer community, of retreating to get a spiritual bypass from dealing with this hard work that Angela's talking about, with the only caveat I would add is that it's hard work that has to be done with the centrality of anti-Black racism, but not an exclusivity of anti-Black racism, and that your pain still counts as well.
What I say to most of the white people who come to me wondering about their leadership is that I am not encouraging you to step down. That I think that what the real challenge is how to be a white leader for racial equity. Because if the only people who are concerned about racial equity are people of color, then we are not making the progress that we have to make. And to be a white leader for racial equity means that you've got to be able to endure some of what leaders of color have endured. Because I said this to John almost in jest a couple of weeks ago, but after I said it, I thought about it and realized how true it was. And that is that my most important strength in terms of my work for social change comes from not belonging. And the fact that I have sort of not belonged everywhere has meant that I can be comfortable not belonging anywhere. And being comfortable not belonging anywhere really has been a wonderful gift to me because it allows me, as a person who's interested in social change and how do I bring people along and how do I put myself wherever the change is needed, whether anybody's welcoming me or not, and figure out how to make some difference, is to be comfortable not belonging and to do what you do when you're an outsider. You listen differently. You try to find the place where maybe we got a little something in common. You try to see if there's somebody there who you've got a little bit of connection with and maybe you can get them helping you what you want to do. That people who feel that they belong everywhere don't. And therefore, when they walk into a situation where they are out of place, they often are kind of like a bull in a china shop, or they just retreat, or they turn around and go stand in a corner. Being able to figure that out is what people of color who are leaders have to do all the time. How to be able to get your feelings hurt and know it wasn't about you. If it was about you, it was not really about you. Why did that person want to undermine your leadership? Why did that person want you to feel less? It's not really about you, it's about them needing to do that. But if you understand that it's not about you, it doesn't hurt as much. Being in a room as a Black woman, can you imagine how many times I have been in rooms filled with white men and I have said something that was probably worth paying attention to, but nobody heard it until the white man said it, and then all of a sudden everybody turned their head to him and said, what a great idea that was. Can you imagine how many times I have experienced that? And it doesn't send me home crying. It doesn't send me under the table. You know what I usually say? I'm so glad that Jim now agrees with me. Now can we talk about this? You know, I just use it to keep going. But a million slights, and they never stopped me. They never made me think I shouldn't be taking on this leadership position. They never made me say maybe I shouldn't be here. It never made me say it's just so painful being in this situation. I'm just going to go find a different place. That's what I say to the white leaders who come to me. You know, not that I feel sorry for you. I say I'm appreciating you. I'm appreciating that you're in this leadership position and you're calling out that it's hard. And let me tell you how hard it can be. And now we'll talk about what the strategies are, because the only people who are leading for change are the people who have been victimized and marginalized and discriminated against. We're not moving very fast in the direction that we need to go.
So I see we have about 20 minutes left. And I don't know what the format is, but what do you think about seeing if people in the audience have any
I would
questions?
love that.
So we're going to open it up and see if you have any questions or comments. And if you would stand up and say your name, and then if you have a question or comment, and try to keep it relatively short. And then where appropriate, we'll try to respond.
The question is, how do we keep going forward and not step back? The speaker was saying that she actually thought when President Obama got elected that we were at an inflection point and that we were going to be moving along in a different direction. I thought so too. I thought so too. I was in New York City when the votes came in, and that next morning when I walked out on the street to go get coffee, it was a different New York City. It really was. I mean, people were just so joyous. It did not last. I think that we actually are moving forward, and that it's hard to see, because the people who are fighting to maintain the phrase that I often use in talking about this is you have people who are being nostalgic for a time that never was, while ignoring a future that is inevitable. And I think that's exactly what's going on. I think that is a minority group, but it's getting a lot of attention. The media is overplaying it, and so it looms larger than it is for that reason, but it is big. But what I also think that it is a last gasp. And a last gasp can be long and shrill and dangerous. So it is not to dismiss it, but it is last. It is the past, it is not the future. And people are finding themselves, they are engaging in transformative solidarity, they are questioning institutions, and they are questioning practices and customs and beliefs that have never been questioned before. And that's what I'm attaching myself to. That's what I'm attaching myself to. So I get up energized every day. I see the problem. I see the danger. I see the peril. As I said in my opening remarks, this is our moment and we have agency. How are we going to use it? If we find each other, lean in and use it, we will get to a much better place and we will stand there and go forward. But this is a perilous moment. It is a last gasp. Can be long and shrill and dangerous as we are experiencing, but it is last.
Other questions and comments? In the back there. So the question was, wanted to hear more about racism and the climate and othering and belonging in the context of the climate and racism. I'll start, Angela, if you don't mind. And, as I set out early on, and it's all of these things are complicated. But if you think about modernity, which I imagine most of you were not thinking about a few minutes ago, modernity is about 500 years old. And so what does that mean, modernity? Modernity is a period where the West broke from pre-modern. Of course, the people who were living in pre-modern didn't call themselves pre-modern. They were just living their lives. But what's distinctive about what we now call pre-modern and modern is pre-modern Westerners believed that they were part of nature, that nature was alive. Most of them were polytheists. They worshiped the gods, not God, but the gods. They worshiped the earth. That was not always nice. I mean, there were human sacrifices. People were terrified of nature in many ways. It's thunder and lightning outside, the gods must be angry. But the world was sort of alive and it was magical, sometimes in a horrific way, but it was alive. What the Enlightenment Project was, which is sort of the birth of modernity, if you will, was a break from that. And there were a number of people who were associated with that, including Newton, who basically said the universe is like a clock. It's not alive, there's no regard of the universe of you as human beings. And we're separate And again, that separations, they were separate from the universe. And so what's nature then if we're not an extension of it? Nature is the thing to be exploited, to be controlled. Yeah, nature sometimes can be difficult. So you have to whip her into shape. And nature was associated with the feminine. And that's the same time, though, 500 years ago, when Portugal and then the English were starting to explore other worlds, particularly Africa and South America. And they saw people more often than not living close to nature. And to them, that was an indication that they were less than modern. They were uncivilized. And there's a whole thing about uncivility and the Native Americans. They were associated with nature. And so that quickly translated into associating, those being associated with nature was not a good thing. That was proof that they had not evolved to be the modern. And anyway, there's just many iterations of that. And then, of course, it got some sanction from the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church was the main institution at the time, to go out and conquer nature, and to go out and conquer uncivilized people living close to nature. And it's an interesting story. There's a period of time where they asked the Pope, could they enslave Christians? Which actually meant Catholics, because Protestant wasn't a big deal yet. It hadn't even taken foot. And the Pope said no. And so they were enslaving, essentially, people of European descent and people of African descent. And the Europeans all became Catholics. And they had to be emancipated. And the Africans, it's like, what's going on? Why is that person being emancipated? It's like, because they became Christian. It's like, can I become a Christian too? And there was this huge conversion of Africans to Catholicism. And the elites got together and said, this is not working. That's not what we had in mind. There were many other factors going on in terms of the need for, interestingly enough, initially the needs for trees. Because before coal was really its mammoth, it was trees. And Europe was just chopping down all of its trees for the Industrial Revolution. So all these things are happening at the same time. But they don't just happen. There's a story that explains they're happening. Why is this happening? And the story didn't evolve immediately. It took hundreds of years to evolve the story. It took hundreds of years for us to come to a racial understanding and tying both the savages, blacks and Native Americans, with nature, and to be dominated by whites. And the last part of this was interesting, was that the idea was you could actually teach potentially, and there was a split between those who believed that blacks were inherently inferior and close to nature, and those who believed they could be civilized. So you had that split among whites, some believing that they could not be civilized, and some believing that they could be civilized. At the same time, you had the making of the white race. There's actually a book by Theodore Allen called The Invention of the White Race. Because remember, people weren't racialized initially. They didn't look at people and say, oh, you're white. It's like whiteness is a concept. It's not a description of someone's biology. And so they had to describe what it meant to be white. And it eventually became part of this project. And I write about this called the Enlightenment Project. So it makes sense then that we have this hierarchical great chain of being between nature and God, and great chain of being between one race and another race. And we're sort of rethinking that now. And in rethinking it, one of the things we're not thinking hard enough is there's some, I think, romanticism of can we go back to the way it was before the Enlightenment, before modernity. And I think we can learn from that, but I don't think we can go back there. So we have to go forward. And we don't quite know how to go forward. But can we go forward recognizing that there's no hierarchy and that we're in relationship with nature? And if we can, what does that look like? Yes.
do I have a practice of feeling belonging when I might otherwise feel othering? No. What I have is a practice, which I described before, of knowing that everybody deserves my respect. I often say that everybody gets my respect. You have to earn my disrespect, and that does not come easily. That's how I enter the world. Um, and I really do. I hate suffering and hurt. And when I see it, I acknowledge it. I acknowledge it. I live in Oakland near Lake Merritt, and I can see the lake from my bedroom window, and I see tents out of the window that I look at when I'm making up my bed. So every morning when I put those pillows on that side of the bed, I am looking out of the window and I am looking at tents. And every morning I allow myself to take that in, to just take it in. And I do it, you know? I probably could get going a little faster if I didn't do it, but it's important to me to do it. And none of this do I call belonging. What I call it, or maybe I do, it's like, it's being human. And it's respect. And it's what I learned from my mother and my father. My mother loved to read and my father loved to lead. And between the two of them, there was a lot of wisdom that got passed on. Now, my father was a teacher and he taught at what would be called, I guess, an inner city high school, but he taught at one of the two black high schools in St. Louis, Missouri. And I remember listening to him as he would talk with great pride about how when he passed the young men in the hall, he always called them Mister. He knew their names and he always called them Mister. And if they were wearing a hat, he said he could just touch his head and they would take the hat off. I don't have any exercises I do. I just try to be in the world and be cognizant of it and to be sad about the wrong that's in it and to be grateful that I can get up and start doing something about it and try to make sure that the thing I do about it is the most informed thing. You know, I need to be educated, that it's the most collaborative thing. I need to know who else is doing it, that it's the most add value thing. I don't need to do something just to be doing something. It should be adding value. And that I can kind of take account at the end of the day.
So let me respond to that question as well. I think it's very important. And Angela, I don't know if you want to add anything to what you said, but when you talked about bringing love more deliberately into your working practice, I don't know if you want to add anything about that, because that's where my mind went in part when the question was
What I
asked.
actually said was bringing joy. I didn't say bringing love. I'm still working on bringing the love, but I've started bringing the joy.
All right. So if you go online and just Google lessons from suffering, something I wrote 10 years ago. My father was a Christian minister. Many of you heard me talk about my father. My family is a profoundly loving family. And a lot of suffering, but tremendous joy and love. And when I left the church, I was not so much attached to that joy and love and much more hard in some ways. But at some point, well, not even at some point, I did, in that searching for something to connect with when I left the church of my father and mother, it took me to many different places. And I remember sitting with Goenka and just being furious. I was full of piss and vinegar, and more piss and vinegar. And Goenka, I don't know if you ever saw him or met him, but he was a big man. And we'd have the meditation practice. It wasn't the only practice that I I tried everything. Tried drugs. I tried, just something had to be different. But Goenka was a big man, and you'd get up in the morning at 5 o'clock and you start sitting, and then you'd have breakfast, and your last meal would be at before noon. You have one chapati, and then every 3 days or so, Goenka would sit with you and ask, "How's your practice going?" And so I remember, and this was in India, he called me in and said, "How's your practice going?" And I was just furious. And the stories I was running in my mind. It's like, there's no way this big guy could be eating one chapati. He's sneaking into the kitchen at night, eating after all of us are asleep. He's a fraud. And I'm not opening up to him. He's a liar. So he said, "And your practice?" I said, "Fine." And energetically or something, he knew it was not fine. And he said, "Mr. Powell, if I've done anything to hurt or offend you, I'm asking your forgiveness." And I just started crying. And when I went back to sit, all that anger and cynicism, I could just energetically, it just was whirling inside of me. And it's not that I haven't gotten angry or cynical since then, but it never came back that way. And so what I wrote, which I'm sort of recommending to you, is this piece I wrote called Lessons from Suffering. And what I started doing, I looked at how a number of the religious traditions are organized with deal with suffering. And so it's a longer answer, but I'll just give you the shorthand of it. And people have heard me say this before. We are literally born connected to another human being. Almost every biological scientist, evolutionary scientist will tell you humans will not survive without belonging. And to me, it's not, we are connected. We may not acknowledge it. We may hate it. As James Baldwin said, sometimes we think it's unfair, but we can't do anything about it. We can do something about it. We can mess it up. We can deny it. We can be pissed about it. And part of it is because of suffering. Part of it is because of pain. It's like I cut myself off from you because I'm afraid you're going to hurt me. And not realizing that when I cut myself off from you, I've hurt myself. And so I start with my family, just the love of having my family. And I do try to do some things. And I don't always do it. I'll tell you this one last story. I'm in my favorite coffee shop the other day in Albany called Hal's. And I had been out of town, and there was a story, and I think the story was, it's along Solano Avenue, if you know Berkeley at all. There had been apparently a black man who had been going up to school children and trying to get them into the car or something. So the whole neighborhood was like, our kids, someone's trying to steal our kids. And I'm sitting there at the parklet having my coffee, and there's this group of guys sitting across from me. And this one guy, he looked, I'd say Indian, I'm not sure, Asian Indian, and he's just staring at me. And again, that same kind of voice, that Goenka type voice was coming in my head. It's like, what is he staring at? I didn't take your kids. What do you think? You think I don't belong here? It's such, I live in this neighborhood. It's and so after a while, he gets up and he walks toward me and literally my mind is going like, what is this jerk going to say to me? And what's going to be my response? And he walks over to me and he says, the world can be hard. There's all this war in Europe and all this bad stuff happening. He said, but then I look at these beautiful flowers and they're just enjoy and give a radiation of love. And he said, and I feel that you're an extension of that. I don't want to thank you for radiating love. And I'm thinking,
You must have felt like.
no, I'm not making this. It's like, man, I got that one wrong. But it just reminded me of how much of the suffering we experience is self-generated. It's not that there's not a lot of suffering that other people visit upon us, and I call it surplus suffering, that we suffer just because we're alive. But we don't have to be homeless. We don't have to be shot by the police. We don't have to be, disrespected in school. That's surplus suffering. Even if we take all that away, we still would suffer. And so I think for me, being in touch with that, my suffering and others' suffering, and realizing that everyone suffers and everyone belongs. And Maya Angelou, I don't know if I've sent it to you, Angela. If not, I will. She says, one of her pieces, she says, I belong no place, and therefore I belong every place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe take one more question. And then...
Sure. If there's one more question? You got
Thank you.
that? And then
Yeah.
I'll say, go ahead, take that one.
So the last question was about how do we let go of the story of othering so that we can tell a better story of belonging, and especially as it relates to people from across the globe, like the Chinese. There's a lot of positive things out there. I run this thing called Perception Institute, which studies the mind science. And people get a lot of this wrong, but people talk about we naturally other people, we naturally are afraid of other people, and there's some studies to suggest that. But there's also studies to suggest that there's this thing called mirror neurons, that we actually, when we resonate with another person, it's really uplifting, that we're wired to want to relate. We're wired to relate. I talked about the part of the brain in the video, that when we see another human being, part of the brain lights up. It's like, another human being. So we have both of those capacities on a small and large scale. If you read Harari's book, Sapiens, he talks about tribes existed for the first 2 million years we were here as human beings. They were only 50 people for the most part, people you live with every day. And what allowed for larger tribes or larger gatherings of people were better stories. That we told stories of people about a racial group or about a religious group. 1.2 billion Christians, that's not a tribe. That's a grand story. But somehow they feel something toward each other. So one of the things is, can we tell a better story? Can we tell a story that animates all of our belonging? And the great potential threat to belonging is fear. And we all have fear. By some accounts, fear is the oldest emotion. And so what some people do is to tell stories about those groups. The other is a threat to you. Can we tell a story and a practice where even if we're afraid, we still hold on to our belonging? And to me, and this is woefully short, but to me, it's not an option. We are connected. As James Baldwin says, we can't do anything about it, meaning we can't break that connection, but we can learn to live into it. And I would say be in community, be in relationship. And oftentimes when we're afraid, when we're scared, that's where the work is. That's actually pointing, and that's why I wrote that piece, Lessons from Suffering. Suffering's not just bad. Suffering is offering us lessons. We don't always learn them. We just have to look at the COVID as an example. Beautiful opportunity to learn, and we learn by and large the wrong lesson.
Just to say a word about the other two questions, the notion of intersectionality, it is just such a deep concept, and the way Kimberly Crenshaw talks about it, and now there's a whole literature on it, but when you talk about being Black and being immigrant, it's exactly the kind of thing that we need to bring into our conversations so that we don't allow these things to be isolated. It's what John was trying to say when he said not to let the Black-white paradigm becomes so dominant in your mind that you can't see how it's impacting everything else. As I said, the Black-white paradigm is defining, embedded, continuing, and inadequate. And the inadequate part of it is it does not explain everybody else's experience if you can't look at that nuance. But when you have these things that are operating together, it gives you an opportunity to have deep understanding. I would love to talk about the hierarchy of human value in Africa because that is a context in which you definitely see it, and it definitely makes John's point when he talks about the fact that it's not always color. Sometimes it can be a difference that it's very hard for anybody who's not in that society carefully to see what's going on. And so we need to know a lot more about that. And Paloma, the thing that I would say is the one thing that we can do is hold ourselves to finding the highest points of agreement. The one thing that really kills transformative solidarity is to settle for the lowest common denominator. And that's often what we settle for, just to be able to keep everybody in the tent. The most important thing is to lift up, to articulate the highest, most aspirational things that we can agree upon and work toward that, learning how to let go and how to add to what you bring so that we can do that effectively. I so appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.